Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of The Lambda Show. I'm your host, Matt Moore. Joining me today is my co-host, Dave Clausen. Hello, Dave.
Hello.
And also joining us today is Shelby Cohen and Katie Levy. I hope I pronounced your names correctly all the way.
Yes, you did.
Awesome. We're talking to Katie and Shelby today because a little bit ago, there was this thing called Kotlin Conf before COVID existed and we were all in lockdown. And at Kotlin Conf, there was this awesome talk given by these two folks about functional programming in Kotlin. I believe the title of that talk, correct me if I'm wrong, was What the FP is Kotlin?
Yes, that was it.
Great title, by the way. That talk was awesome to me. I was very interested, and Dave and I had talked about that, and we watched it actually 2 or 3 times, I think, between the two of us. Broadly speaking, a couple of categories we were interested in with that talk. One is, obviously, it was in Kotlin, which is a language Dave and I use, and the functional programming side caught our attention as well. Now, I've been doing functional programming for a number of years now, but I've never really enjoyed some of the, I want to say, hardcore mathematics gatekeeping that can sometimes go on in that community. So I'm always interested in ways to help folks get into functional programming in intuitive ways that could be easily understood. And Shelby and Katie, I wanted to call you out in particular for, I think, giving a very good overview of that in your talks. And I want to dig into later, like some of the resources that helps the two of you sort of get in that, why you started in functional programming to begin with. The other aspect of this in this show I'd like to discuss is organizational change. You two managed to convince an organization to change into a completely different programming paradigm, which I can say is, from my perspective in history, not very easy to pull off. And the fact that you both managed to do that caught my interest. And I'd like to talk about maybe some of the ways that you approached that and kind of how things worked out. And I'm actually curious too now, if you're going to go try to do this at your new companies that you're starting at. So, all right. So Shelby, you're starting a new job at Twitter.
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
no,
right.
this is very new. This is my first week that I'm like in between, and I'm gonna start Twitter in November.
Gotcha. Well, awesome, and congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
All right, and okay, yeah. So the two of you were at Intuit before. See, that's what I had originally found out about you guys was at when you were at Intuit and you went to Kotlin Conf and gave that talk, which was awesome. And then I was like, hey, we should interview them on this topic because I love functional programming, and Dave does as well. All right, so Katie, you are at Amazon. Okay, cool. Congrats on being at Amazon.
It's been 1 month, so it's still pretty fresh for me too.
So I have to ask because of, the times we're in. I'm guessing you're both working from home. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how's that going?
Good.
It's good. It was definitely a different onboarding experience, but overall, I think it worked out pretty well, and we'll be back in the office at some point and get to see everyone face to face. But yeah, definitely weird, just remote work for now.
And are both of those offices? I mean, Amazon's obviously based in Seattle, but is Twitter? Are you? If you were in an office, where would your office be? I guess is my question.
Yeah, they have a Boston location in Cambridge. So I will be going into the office some amount of time once it opens up, but also have the option to be remote if I want to be.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah.
I don't know if I told you, Dave, but I actually just got set up for remote, like fully as well. So it's how do you?
Wait, what were you doing before?
Good question.
Vacation?
I was on vacation all year. It was awesome.
You were not.
I
You
was.
big liar.
I know. No, it's permanent remote now. So past the COVID pandemic, I'll be fully remote. I don't know if I'm going to like that or not, and I'm actually curious how you all have been enjoying being remote during this time.
With Intuit, at least, I think we were working from home since March, maybe. And so we got really used to it, and our teams definitely did things to help being remote. So we had, virtual coffee meetings, different ways to stay connected. Also, we did some like pair programming on my team. virtually. So there's this new plugin in IntelliJ you can use. It's called Code with Me. And we've been using that to collaborate more, even though it's very easy to be isolated and work independently. We definitely tried to find lots of ways to stay connected.
Awesome. Actually, I'm very interested in that plugin to IntelliJ. I also use IntelliJ as my main editor, and it's yeah, I've tried a variety of things, Google Meet, screen sharing, with teammates and folks, and it can be interesting. So
definitely. Yeah, I've only
too.
tried it. I've only tried the plugin once, and it's a really new plugin. But it was awesome to start with. It felt like we were, in person together. We could both control the screen.
Okay, I was going to ask about that because that's like the big thing with Google Meet. You can't really do.
Yep.
Awesome. I guess first question for you to start off is, how did you get started in Kotlin?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the reason why we actually were exposed to Kotlin was because of functional programming. We were both new to junior engineers at Intuit, and we were both working in Java. And there was this functional programming meetup that one of our staff engineers led, and people from all over San Diego could come to the meetup. It wasn't just Intuit employees. And we attended that. And that was our first exposure to functional programming. And like you said, it definitely can be a bit scary in certain languages. Haskell was definitely intimidating to us. Scala, we'd work with a little, but not a lot. And Kotlin was the first language that was more approachable than anything else for us to start learning the basics of functional programming. And so we just kept attending this meetup and learning more about the language as we went, not really using it on our own teams yet, but just getting our feet wet, starting to learn about what functional programming is and using Kotlin as a tool to help teach ourselves.
That's interesting to me because historically what I've seen is folks get started in Kotlin first, then they start discovering like this thing called functional programming, and they get familiar with things like map, filter, reduce, those concepts, and then they hear about Arrow, which we'll talk about Arrow in a bit. So I want to get your thoughts on that. Okay, so when you got started doing functional programming with Kotlin, what were some of the would you say pain points? Did it help that you already kind of had tinkered? You mentioned Haskell, you mentioned Scala as well. Did it help that you had kind of used those languages before, or at least experimented with them, or do you think not at all? Like, was this just Kotlin was a great place to start for someone who had never seen functional programming before?
I think both of us kind of came from a Java background, and not having as much exposure to functional programming in Java, like seeing Kotlin and seeing the built-in functions and the way that you could do functional programming in Kotlin really helped us learn functional programming concepts, and kind of it just like encourages you to use functional programming with some of like the syntactic sugar and things that are kind of encouraged, like immutables, things you can use libraries for with Java, but it doesn't feel as natural. So I would say that was the biggest aspect, is like having it kind of baked into the language helped us learn it a lot.
Yeah, and we also just felt like the transition from Java to Kotlin was a very smooth transition. So we didn't really need to dive into all these other languages that were more functional languages at first. We kind of just went slowly between Java to Kotlin. And then as we learned more and more, that's when we started, writing more pure Kotlin code with Arrow and other things added on. But it was just like a step-by-step process where we would slowly learn a new thing and introduce it along the way.
It's kind of fascinating because I'm, like Matt said, I'm one of those people that started out knowing Java and then moving to Kotlin, and then realizing more and more that there are all these cool things that could be done that were part of functional. So a little different take on it. But that's very interesting, the way that you kind of went about that. Are you currently still using Kotlin in your new jobs, or are you using other languages? And if so, are you doing functional principles in those new languages?
Yeah, so I haven't actually started my new role yet. But on my most recent team at Intuit, I was using Kotlin all the time for an Android application, and on the JVM, more server-side work. We didn't actually use Arrow on my most recent team, but we were very into writing as code as functionally as we could in Kotlin. And yeah, it was production code at industry level. I think introducing functional programming in Kotlin is a lot less intimidating maybe than introducing functional programming in Kotlin and Arrow at the same time. I think we've both had experiences on previous teams where introducing too much at once isn't always the best way to approach it. And so that's kind of where our perspective comes from, of the let's do things step by step, because we found that makes it easier to influence a community to start using something new if you don't overwhelm them with too much functional programming, since some people have, some myths about what functional programming is, and we need to like deconstruct those myths to actually teach people about what we're trying to do.
You just brought something very interesting up that I wanted to touch on here. I'm going to ask you, because this is a very sort of blurred line here. What is functional programming?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Oh, zinger.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good one. And I think, we're still asking ourselves that. And there's lots and lots of different ways to introduce functional programming to your projects. I think we tend to lean to the side of how you can practically add it to your projects. And so we focus first on like immutability and no side effects. And we just try to avoid shared mutable state all the time. But I think there's more, I don't want to say maybe intense, or there's a side of it that gets very mathematical and things that, we might not necessarily need to know how exactly it works under the hood, but we need to understand the larger concepts. And yeah, I don't know, Katie, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I think at first it can sound really scary, like we've kind of said, but there's like small steps you can take to kind of use functional programming, but not, it's really hard to have a fully functional programming sort of setup. But it is kind of a mind shift to kind of think in a way that is functional. And having a lot of chaining, I think that's kind of been helping us a lot. When we started was the map, the filter, the flat map, and then we kind of got into reactive programming as well. And a lot of those libraries like Project Reactor kind of have the chaining set up, which helps you, kind of give an input. With the same input, you're always gonna have the same output. And then just have different operations similar to mathematical equations, but not as, mathy with the more mathy languages and stuff. It's like just in Kotlin kind of written out in the functions. So yeah, I think that's a big aspect of it.
Yeah, and it's definitely challenging when, everyone has different definitions of what functional programming is. And, it was intimidating for us when we first started learning about it, because some of the concepts are really hard to understand, and breaking it down into smaller pieces that we can actually do on a day-to-day basis was our main priority when we started learning about functional programming.
Matt and I have talked about this, and I don't know if both of you feel this way, but I kind of learn by doing or seeing examples of how things should be done. And I feel like at the easier level of functional programming, like immutability is relatively easy to understand, and not having shared state and not avoiding side effects and having a function return. All those things are relatively straightforward once you get used to them. But I found it very difficult to get my head around, like, what's a monoid? What are all of these other mathematical terms, and what does that actually mean in terms of physical code? And I just feel like we're lacking really great tutorials or information that walks you through that next level beyond kind of the basics. And I was wondering if you feel that way, and if you don't feel that way and you know of good resources, if you could hand them on to me.
Yeah. No, we've definitely struggled with that next step too, and going a little deeper. And it's been something that we've been working on too, on how can we help teach that next level. And it's really challenging. There are a few resources that we used when we were starting out. We were doing functional programming in Java. And there's a book about that. It's just called Functional Programming in Java. And seeing practical examples of the code right after they explain the definition of whatever functional programming topic they're trying to teach was really helpful for us. And we also went through that and converted, some of those Java exercises to Kotlin exercises. So that's one resource we have.
Yeah, I think it really helped us learning in a kind of group setting. So we attended this meetup that Shelby was talking about earlier, that we met like once a week for an hour during lunch, and it was all people that were interested in functional programming. Some people already were really good, knew so much. Some people didn't even know what anything meant. So it was nice being in a room where we could work together to kind of refactor code and see like, wow, how can you make this more functional? And honestly, the first few times I went, I was like, what do these functions mean? Like, people would try to explain it and whiteboard it out, and it just kind of went over my head. And then after a few times hearing it again and again and seeing the examples, I finally kind of got a better understanding of it. And then on top of that, there'd be the little sprinkles of the different terms and the more in-depth functional programming concepts. But it wasn't like the main subject of the meetup. It would just be in terms of this functional programming that's kind of like a practical use case. This is what this term means. That might sound really scary. And it would help me kind of visualize through examples and with other people explaining it in different ways all together. So I think the group setting really helps for that. And that's kind of hard to find as you're just learning on your own. But there's great meetups out there that can kind of help you guide as you're learning it, people that are more experienced, giving you insights.
Yeah. And then also I would just add that, Lambda World was canceled this year, but we spoke last year at Lambda World, and seeing different talks there about functional programming. I know we definitely learned by doing as well, but learning about different open source projects or different things that are going on in the functional programming community has helped us along the way. Just same as Katie was saying, sprinkle in a little more depth along the way, not all at once. That's how we've been learning.
Have either of you, out of curiosity, I've started to watch the Bartosz Milewski, I'm probably saying that wrong, series of videos, Category Theory for Programmers. It's delving a bit into the nerdy math side of this, but I was wondering if either of you have gone through that and what you think.
No, we haven't, but we'll definitely check it out.
I didn't think I would like it because I tend to not like the theory as much. But I think he's really an interesting guy, and it's the most interesting part of it for me is category theory is more or less like the unified theory for mathematics and software, which is kind of cool. I don't know, Matt, have you watched all of those?
I have. It's been a bit of time. So
yeah.
But yeah, I basically spent the better part of a year digging into category theory as much as I could. And as I was doing that, I found myself feeling that, yeah, this is definitely interesting. Like, it interests me from a theoretical perspective. But when it came to actually applying those concepts for day-to-day code, I mean, to your point, Shelby, like, there's all of these things that, you can learn about, but does it actually get people to a point where they can start coding functionally? I've worked with shops currently who do functional programming that spend a lot of time getting into, I don't want to say debates, but discussions, which can be interesting in their own right, but discussions about like catamorphisms and, how do you do F algebras and all of this stuff? And then people start throwing these terms around, and it's like, what is an F algebra? What is a catamorphism? It's like, and by the way, audience, we're not going to get into those topics in the show. That is like a whole nother thing. But I do think that the category theory stuff, it definitely is interesting. If you are looking for, from my perspective, if you're looking for that unifying theory and you want to kind of like get into how these ideas started and maybe kind of like the next future in functional programming, like where things might be going. Yeah, I found that helpful. To answer your question, Dave, that for me, that was kind of where I was like a past, present, and future understanding of like kind of where some of these things are coming from. But I wonder if for folks who want to do functional programming in a practical sense at their jobs on a daily basis, I wonder if that really has any value from that perspective. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah.
I mean, we can throw it back to Katie and Shelby, but this is my concern is there's already, as Matt said, there's a lot of gatekeeping language. There's, you start calling things monoids and, applicative and functors. It's like those words don't mean anything. And the software industry is already full of terms that are ambiguous and confusing. I think map is one of those. What's a map? Well, it's a data structure. No, it's not a data structure. It's a way that you can transform things. No, it's, a picture of the earth that's got, there's like, how many definitions of map are there? And that can be frustrating. I think, like Matt, I thought it was kind of interesting to learn a little bit about, but I guess for Katie and Shelby, how do you feel, in terms of all of these various words that often, at least to me, are very confusing? How do you feel you were able to get past that? I mean, you mentioned kind of taking it step by step, but, and do you feel like some of those terms are a little over the top, or do we all just need to learn more about it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think for a practical sense, sometimes those like terms can be brought in just to kind of shed light if people want to dig deeper into it. Like we had a learning community for Kotlin that we would kind of try to do more functional programming and teach Kotlin to a bunch of people. And we would sometimes bring up those terms if people were interested in them and kind of dive into them if the interest was there. But for a more practical sense, kind of just focused on this is how you can apply like map and filter and the tools you can use without digging too much into the theory side of things, but allowing people the option to go deeper if they want to kind of understand things more.
Yeah, and just to add, I would say it's just really important to know your audience. So in certain settings, we definitely nerd out and go into those terms and dive really deep. But in other settings, we talk a lot about influencing a community to use Kotlin and use functional programming. In the settings where it's not as commonly used or people are, apprehensive and nervous to use it, we definitely hold back on that in the beginning because, someone who's not as excited to learn about it as we are will get overwhelmed and will shy away from it. And we've definitely seen throughout the community, the Java community and the Kotlin community a little bit, but mostly Java community, that, some people have a certain idea that functional programming means that you're chaining a lot of functions together and maybe so many functions together that your code becomes unreadable or that it's hard to debug, and lots of different myths about functional programming. And so if we're presenting in front of an audience that has those concerns, we definitely want to address those first before just diving into the crazy terms that they might not be as excited about to learn.
That's interesting. And it actually, the chaining of methods and all that stuff, of course, I'm going to have to switch gears now into Arrow. So I did see in one of your talks that it looks like you had used Arrow. I noticed there was some stuff on the slides there and I was like, ooh, okay, I've seen that before. From what I recall, you were using types like option. I say types actually, by the way, and I'm curious, speaking of terminology, get your opinion on this too. I've stopped using the term monad with people.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Me too. I use types as well.
Okay. I like
Just easier to explain.
Exactly. Okay. So all right, you've had that same experience then. Yeah. So like option type, either type, and things like that. I kind of assume you were using probably IO, but I can't remember if you had talked about that now.
Yep, a little bit. We definitely in some of our talks we explained how when first introducing Arrow, we started with the types, either, option, try, those kinds of things, just because I think they're the simplest to understand, and it really helped clean up our code a lot. And that was after we already transitioned from Java to Kotlin. And luckily, I had a team that everyone was excited to learn new things. Everyone was excited to learn about functional programming. It went pretty smoothly because we were in that setting. And we used it to clean up a lot of our responses from our APIs, and having, the either with a success or failure, with a right or a left. That concept was very straightforward for people to understand. And so I think the simplicity of it was enticing to start using it. And then as we went along, we started using more and more things with Arrow. But I think it's always a fine line on how much you go into it and change your code base when not everyone is on the same level of understanding. So to make sure, you're not writing code that nobody on your team is going to be able to even review or read. So we did a lot of things to help each other learn along the way. I think that it's a really helpful thing to do that when you're introducing any new library or any new framework with your team, to make sure just everyone's on board and on the same page. So we had like our own type of documentation with new Arrow features we were using. And if someone wanted to use one that we had never used before, they were kind of required to do just a mini presentation to the group, just to explain, what's the new Arrow feature and why are we going to use it. But just to keep in mind too, this was an internal developer productivity team. So we had a little more flexibility on the tech we were using, just because our customers were internal and not external. And so it was a little bit of a smaller project than, adding Arrow into one of our bigger products at Intuit.
The new version of Arrow, and I think in a previous conversation, maybe it was on Twitter, Shelby, I'd asked you about Arrow, and you'd said you weren't, I don't think you were using that at present anymore. So completely understandable. But some of the changes I saw in 0.11.0 are the removal of things like IO. I've not had the time to sit down and look at it yet, but it looks like they're going into some kind of coroutine thing that they're doing now.
They are.
Okay. It sounds like maybe you've seen this.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to. My most recent team did not use Arrow, so I haven't played around with that much, but I just read a little bit about it. I have seen a lot of Raul's talks, and just recently he was on, I think it was the London Kotlin meetup group or something, where he was on that. And I'm just excited about the work Arrow's doing with Arrow Meta. And I know some of the other people at Intuit that we work with are excited as well. Yeah, so.
I have to ask you, since you mentioned Arrow Meta, what are your thoughts on pattern matching? And the reason I ask is I'm actually working on pattern matching in Arrow Meta.
Oh, awesome.
So yeah, it was a project I kicked off months ago, and then other things have gotten in the way, both work and personal, but I'm getting back to it again. I have a very initial proof of concept working now with a compiler, but it's the 1.3.6.1, I believe, was the one that we were stuck on with Arrow Meta for so long. Mm-hmm. Now 1.4 is out, and I have to now spend some time making sure everything works correctly for 1.4. But yeah, I was able to get the initial stages of pattern matching working. You can match on types, you can get parameters out of it and all of that. So far, I have IntelliJ recognizing the new syntax as well. And I started doing this just because I really love pattern matching. It's probably one of my most used features in functional languages. And so I was talking about it with Raul and a few others, and they were like, yeah. And I said, well, I think I'm just going to write a compiler plugin to extend this. And Raul was like, how'd you like to bring it into Arrow Meta? And I was like, okay. So I gotta ask you, like, are you, and I know this is like, I say pattern matching for our audience. I'm referring to, in Kotlin, you have the when expression. And yes, you can do like, when match on some like basic types with the is statement and all of that. But proper pattern matching allows you to do very expressive combinations of types, things like wildcards, like if you want to match on a type that is like, say, person to model person record, where you have first name, last name. You want to match a specific first name, but you want to wildcard the last name with an underscore is typically how it's done. You get these more advanced syntactical sugars around being able to match types and values and things like that very nice and cleanly out to then the corresponding expression that should run in conjunction with that condition that was met. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, is that a language feature that you would find super useful, or are you just happy with when the way it is?
No, I think that would be super useful. There's actually the project that I was working on at Intuit. There's another engineer on the team working on contributing to Arrow Meta as well. And I think that pattern matching is going to help our project a lot. So I'm very interested in that feature. I don't know a ton about it, but I'm excited to see what's to come.
Okay, I'll keep working on it.
Awesome.
I have a audience for this plugin of so far one. No, that's not true. There's others who we actually have a channel on Kotlin Lang Slack for this pattern dash matching. So.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, and I've managed to get a few people to join in on this, so I've gotten some help from other folks too, because I knew very little about the actual Kotlin compiler internals at the time of starting this. But Raul was kind enough to sit down with me and help walk me through that. So that was great.
Power of open source.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Can you imagine if this was a commercial project? It would never happen.
No.
You had mentioned before, I want to kind of move back a little bit to resources and training for people and how they can kind of get up to speed on this. You had mentioned before that like I'm going to start with kind of a simple example, like map. How did you teach someone what map is and how to use it?
Yeah. So I think when we first started, we would learn, we'd write it the regular way. At the time, it was the regular way for us. So we'd write like a for loop in our code. And then we could do that first, and then we would convert it to map. And actually, IntelliJ has awesome conversion features. If you just click Option Enter on top of a for loop in Kotlin or in Java, usually gives you the option to automatically convert it to map. Or if you have a for and an if, it will do map filter for you. And I think for us, using those automatic conversions and writing it in the way we were used to in the beginning and then converting it, slowly you start to realize you're writing it using map the first way. And it takes time, but I think it's okay if you have to write it the way you're used to in the beginning and then take your time to convert it, because that's the way you can really understand it. And then before you know it, you'll be adding all these different map, filter, flat map, everything. We just, that's our go-to. That's our first way of doing it now. But when we started, it definitely wasn't the case.
Yeah. And I think on top of that, for teaching other people, like you can teach them the concept and show them an example, but it's really powerful to write in actual, when you're reviewing code and looking at a PR, adding in the comment in the code review saying, hey, you might consider doing it this way, and show them what the using map would look like, and they can visually see for their specific example how to use it, and it teaches them along the way. I think people learn really well with practical examples, so seeing it with their own code and guiding them, that's a great way to get people to use it more. But for some of the more complicated ones, in the past, I've kind of written the code for it, and someone might look at it and be like, this looks really confusing. And I think sitting down with the team and walking through what each step does is such a long-term benefit to teach them how to do it, instead of someone looking at your PR, I mean, like, I have no idea what any of this does, like, whatever, like, we'll just go with it. It's nice to have the full understanding for the whole team, and then people can start using it themselves too.
I love the idea that you mentioned before about each time you incorporated a new arrow feature, that was shared with the team as a way to kind of raise everyone's level and bring their, skill level up. This is something I see at work, which is we have some developers that are very capable, functional people. And then there's some people that just don't understand or know functional at all.
Mhm.
And, if you want to use it to some extent, which I do, I don't do a lot of crazy stuff, but I do all the basics. And, there are some people that to them, even the basic stuff is just radically, I don't understand even what's going on here. What's this map and what's this, flat map? What are we flat mapping? What's an either? None of that makes any sense. And I've tried to do some in-house, training on that, but I really like the idea of kind of slowly, leveling up everyone in the organization. Do you feel like in the organizations you've worked at, how do you both think functional is perceived? Are people mostly interested in it, or is there a mix? Is everyone trying, clamoring to use it, or on the other hand, is there a small group that's trying to use it and a whole bunch of other people that oppose it?
I think things have changed a lot over the past few years. Like when we first started using it, it was kind of new to a lot of people and might have been looked at like, why do we need this? We know how to code in this other way. There's no reason to change things. They're comfortable. So at that time, I felt like it was kind of a smaller group of people trying to teach other people the advantages. And over time, people got more comfortable with it after learning from talks and seeing it in code more, and the popularity just rising. So I think like at this point, it's kind of a common thing to have in a lot of code, and people are kind of like, I should be learning this at least. But it is tricky, and like people that are kind of further behind, you want to make sure they're brought along. A big aspect to that too is having them learn something and teach it too. So that's not only just us teaching people things. I think it's more beneficial if someone is kind of deemed a domain expert on a specific feature, or some kind of like filter, like you're kind of the owner of filter and you're going to teach the team about it. It makes them really dive into it. And then also you can spread out the knowledge more and teach everyone in a larger impact. So that's a great way to kind of bring the team along as well.
Just to add to that, we could sit there and, explain things all day, but when you make them like step out of their comfort zone to learn something and then present it to other people, it's just a different experience for them. And, you don't always get that from just like reviewing other people's code. One other thing we did though is, you don't always get multiple code reviews from people. And if you are writing a lot of functional code and there's other people who don't know as much of what you're doing, it might be intimidating for them to review or comment. But we definitely encourage people to do code reviews and just ask questions and say, can you explain what you're doing here? They might not be saying it's wrong or anything like that. But I think a way that we learned a lot when we didn't have other people on our team specifically using functional programming, we would look at code like PRs that were open on other teams and, just ask questions or just see what they were doing so that we could learn from them.
It's a great idea. I love the idea of like looking at other people's functional code and using that as a mechanism for learning as well. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's so important to know your audience. Like I've been on a team where everyone was kind of scared of functional programming and weren't that comfortable with learning something. So they thought it was so different. And that required a little bit more like training and teaching. Whereas another team I was on, people still didn't know functional programming, but they were really open to learning it and really excited about trying it out. And kind of went off on their own to learn it more so than the other team. So it totally depends on the situation as well, and the people that you're around.
Yeah, it's always good to know. I mean, I'm in this little bubble of people that like functional, and I talk to recruiters occasionally, and whenever I talk to a recruiter, I'm like, what are people asking for? Like what are companies asking for? And there's a fair amount of interest from employers on functional at least in Chicago. I can't speak to anything else, but it's kind of always good to double check your assumptions and see am I veering off into a, obscure little corner of software engineering that no one else is interested in. But it does feel to me like it really is growing and more people are getting interested in it. So, but that's good to know that you're kind of seeing that too.
Yeah, that reminds me of when we went to Lambda World and for Kotlin Conf 2, we were so passionate about functional programming and Kotlin, and we kind of felt like, wow, we might be the only ones and like a few other people that are interested in this. And going to conferences like that, it's amazing to be surrounded by like so many other people passionate about functional programming and for Kotlin Conf Kotlin. It's just exciting to like see the passion in other people and kind of confirmed the time that we invested in teaching other people, learning ourselves. It's really cool.
That reminds me of a funny story. This is apropos of nothing, but when I was first starting out as a software engineer, well, I wasn't even a software engineer. I was just a, little teenager that liked hacking on computers. I had a cousin that worked in the Valley, and he worked for a big company. And I'd been to San Francisco before, but I flew out there when I was like 15 or 16 or something, and went with him to his office. And, I got my first taste of what the actual Valley was like. And I remember being, I don't know, like in a restaurant or walking down the street, and every single person was talking about software. And that was such a weird, it's like in my world in the Midwest, yeah, software is a thing, but you don't go to a restaurant and every single person, one person at a table is talking about, performance, and another person's talking about what the fastest SSDs are, and just having that revelation of like, wow, there's a whole community of people that are weird like I'm weird. So that's got to be cool being at Lambda World and having sort of that experience of, having all these people that are really interested in the same thing you are.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm really glad as well that you guys had that experience of like going to Lambda World. I've actually not been to Lambda World yet. I watched the videos when they come out, but I have not been there yet. Would like to do that at some point. So I guess for me then, kind of the theme I'm sort of settling on here from both of your experiences is start small with folks, introduce, a single concept, right? Don't overload folks. And I think for myself, that's probably something I've done wrong in the past, is trying to overload folks with too much. I'm like, this is easy to me. I've done it for 3 years or whatever. And, but it can be very scary to see at first. And doing compare and contrast, something I've kind of wondered is if we need effectively a sort of functional, I don't know if you've ever seen the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm thinking of like something like the Hitchhiker's Book, but for functional coders, with like compare and contrast. Hey, when you encounter this thing in your code where you're doing a for loop, for example, here's map. Yep. In error handling, like here, use option either IO. Would you say that's kind of sort of the helpful thing, right? Like take code that people have written in an OOP imperative style and compare and contrast that to here's a functional equivalent, and then like pros as to why you'd want to switch.
Yeah, I think we did that just naturally. We would go through examples like that and then heavily rely on IntelliJ and the different options that IntelliJ offered to change your code. But then we didn't have, it'd be great to have a resource like that. But I think also just taking a piece of code that is written imperatively, or maybe just has a lot of mutability, and taking it and refactoring it together and just do like one function or something, because, in a group, when everyone's, saying what they want to change on the whiteboard or on the screen, it definitely takes a lot more time. But going through those exercises together and making code more functional and live coding was super helpful. That I think it was just as helpful as having, a book that is written down with, different examples and converting them, because the code was more, we understood it at a deeper level, I think.
Yeah, and I think if you want to take it even a step further, having kind of a plan for the team is important to make sure everyone's on the same page. We did this specifically a lot more for Kotlin, but you could do a similar thing for functional programming, where you say, like, here are the advantages. This is why we want to use it. Is everyone on board? Okay, what are we going to do to like start it out? Like for Kotlin, we're like, let's just do the unit tests. Like all new unit tests are going to be in Kotlin. Everyone can get comfortable. It's low risk. Next, we're going to do kind of like all new or data classes. Like that's a small step forward. And then all new features. You kind of have a timeline for how long you're expecting everyone to kind of reach these different milestones. So you could say like, we're going to do map. This is like a very simpler functional programming concept. Everyone's going to add it in. If you notice it in a PR that's not like, it's not there, comment it in, and everyone agrees this is the way we're going to move forward. I think that helps kind of set the precedent and make sure everyone is all in agreement what you're going to do for your team.
Awesome. I like that. You've both given me some thoughts that I need to go ponder at this point in terms of how to help teach people. And I appreciate that. A couple of these are kind of unfair questions to throw at you, but it's some stuff I've seen a little bit on Twitter in general and unrelated to functional programming. Microservices, hate them, love them, or think it's more nuanced than that?
Oh, love them.
Love them.
100%. Love them. It's interesting. Like I worked on a more legacy monolithic application for a while in one of my teams, and there are just so many struggles to trying to change something. Like adding in a new feature can have so much risk and so many people involved and like little side effects here and there. It's so difficult to move fast. And then going to teams with microservices is like, wow, like everything is so isolated. You can move so fast without impacting other areas. Everyone knows what they own. 100% in for microservices.
Okay. Good to hear. I'm the same way. I part of what prompted this question, I saw something on Twitter last night and somebody was saying something like microservices are horrible. They're terrible. Why would you ever use them? And, I use them at my company, and, they work pretty well. I mean, they come with their own difficulties, right? You've got you got to worry about network calls. You've got to worry about how they're interfacing. Is it a REST call? Is it something over Kafka? All of that. But yes, they do solve a lot of problems. And I think kind of my thought last night as I was reading this, I was a little frustrated by it. Was kind of like, maybe the reason it's so popular to hate on microservices, at least that's what it feels like to me. It feels like it's popular to hate on them, is because the folks hating on them have never actually worked in environments where they are necessary, and you just can't solve certain problems without them. So anyway, that was kind of my thought. I'm glad to hear that that you like them. Okay, you're not hating on them. That's makes me feel not alone in this, because I feel sometimes like I am alone on this. But anyway, at least in my sphere of Twitter. You mentioned whiteboarding before. Are you a fan of whiteboarding, or do you find that absolutely annoying? I'm thinking about it both in the terms of like you're working with your team, you're trying to obviously diagram or some concept out, but also like during interviews. Whenever I've interviewed people, I sort of have kind of left the whiteboard as an option. Like if I'm interviewing a new candidate coming in, it's like, okay, you can use whiteboard if you want. I give them the choice, and I don't penalize them either way. It depends on how the rest of the interview goes and how well they do in there. But I was just curious what your thoughts are on whiteboarding in general, because I feel like this is another common thing to hate on. There was like a bit of a Twitter thing going on before that I had seen. Whiteboards are terrible. People should stop using them, and I don't know. I don't feel like I hate them. I feel like they can work well, and I feel it's kind of up to each individual person or whoever you're working with. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that using a whiteboard for some things is really good, and then other things is more challenging. So for example, with, coding interviews, writing code on a whiteboard with the correct syntax, that kind of thing, I think I lean more away from that. But in terms of whiteboarding to show like a larger architecture or design and really visualize your thinking and maybe the way that the data is flowing or kind of brainstorming different architectural decisions, I think the whiteboard is super helpful to share, because sometimes you have this idea in your head and you need to just get it out on paper or something like that. But I agree in interview settings or when we're talking about specific code, unless you're writing pseudocode, I don't think the whiteboard is completely necessary. If someone wants to use it, yeah, go for it for sure. But I think it's more useful for design decisions.
I agree. I'm going to jump in on this and say I agree 100%. I think interviews is a pet peeve of mine. Like coding on a whiteboard, it's like if you want to have someone prove to you they know how to sail, would you have them do it on a railroad track? It just doesn't make any. It's silly, right?
Right. That's a good
well, maybe I like sailing on railroad tracks, Dave.
Maybe you do. Maybe you will be the
I'm the one
trained sailor.
I'm the one person on the planet who likes that.
Right. But I think that's Matt and I have had discussions about this before, and I think maybe we even did a podcast on it about, interviewing in software engineering is a little messed up. And actually, that's a good question for both of you. You both have worked at large companies. How do you feel about how the interview process went? What did you like? What didn't you like? And if you were in charge of the world, how would you change the interview process?
That's a great question. Yeah, we just both went through lots of interviews, both transitioning jobs, and I think we have a lot of thoughts on it. We also both were involved in being interviewers at Intuit for entry level and above. So, we've seen it from both sides. I think that there are a lot of companies doing a ton of work to make sure they're eliminating bias in their interviews and trying to have, a diverse panel, different reviewers, lots of different steps to try and help. And that's great. But that being said, I think it is still really challenging that there's this idea of a coding test where you come in and you're asked a question on something you might have not worked on since college or for a long time, and being able to remember all these different algorithms that you might not use on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's a lot of work to be done with the interview process. I really commend companies who are asking a lot of questions about, your leadership style, your communication skills, because that's such a huge part of software engineering that isn't always interviewed at a deep level. I also love when companies talk about more design questions and more architecture decisions. I've even had an interview where they were giving me some sort of problem and I didn't know the code base. And they said, okay, we have this problem. You found this bug. Someone said we have a problem. What do you do next? And you had to ask for different information. Like, let me look at the logs and let me see what's the transactions per second. What's the issue? Like all these different things. And that's like a real world scenario of what you're going to be doing as a software engineer. And so I think the more we can make these interviews practical, the better. Other companies too do a lot of like take home craft demo type of things, which I really like as well, because, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be given an assignment, a problem, and you're going to need to solve it and figure it out. And you should be able to use your ID and your normal setup. And so I think companies evaluating on that are also going the right way in evaluating candidates.
Yeah, I would say +1 to all of that. Another big pain point is the time investment. I mean, for both of us, like having a full-time job and interviewing is a whole nother full-time job. You're just investing so much time into an interview. It's ridiculous to have 5 back-to-back hour-long interviews and be kind of delirious at the end because you've been put on the spot so many times in front of different people. It's just a weird setting to be in. Just to also want to echo out the biasy part, like having rubrics in your evaluation is so important, and having multiple people giving their opinion and not having necessarily groupthink is important. So you have everyone's opinion really brought in and eliminating a lot more bias.
That's a great answer. I'm going to +1 everything both of you said. So
Great.
yeah, I 100% agree that having it be, much more practical, more real world, less theoretical, and less bias and trick questions. I had an interview where someone said, in Java, what's the most performant way to do this and this and this? And it's like, oh, really? I mean, is this really what you think is a prerequisite to having a job here? Is some, bit of trivia about the JDK? And it wasn't like, a basic question. It was like this engineer had specifically dug down into the depths of something and said, I've found it. I've found a nugget of gold that no one else will know the answer to, and this will be a fun thing to ask them because no one will know. That kind of thing just sort of makes me crazy.
A lot of times it depends on who your interviewer is too, which is crazy to think. Like based off of your interviewer, you could get a yes or a no. I found it interesting how much people help along the way. Some people are great at being interviewers and know when you get stuck exactly what to say to kind of guide you, but not necessarily give you the answer. Whereas other interviewers just sit there and don't say anything, and you're like, okay, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
Especially when you can't tell from their face, from the silent member, if they're mad at you or...
Yeah, and I think that companies that you get to interview with the team you're potentially going to is awesome because, you can start to get an insight into what collaboration looks like on that team. And so it can be I love companies that do that let you interview with the team members.
That's definitely a plus.
Oh yeah, and there was one other thing that Dave you reminded me of where asking a specific question about Java, some little nitpicky thing. I actually really like to, if the candidate has a question maybe about syntax or an algorithm, something, I actually like, if they're sharing their screen, if I'll say, yeah, no, don't worry about it. You can look it up. And so, watching them do quick research on, they don't know something, they have to figure it out, and then they have to apply it to their code. I love watching that. I think they should be able to look it up. There's never a point in your job where you're not allowed to Google something. So that's part of being a software engineer. And I think we should do a better job at interviewing that skill.
Thank you so much for saying that. Seriously, this is the biggest pain point for me. And I 100% agree with what you said, Shelby. The job of a software engineer is to solve problems, not to memorize the JVM details.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%.
I want to just quickly give you both a chance to, is there anything specific you'd like to call out or share about how folks can get in touch with you? Are there any upcoming talks that either of you are going to do at some point? COVID notwithstanding.
Yeah. Unfortunately, some of our upcoming talks were canceled. But we are still looking for more to do.
We also have a lot of our previous talks on YouTube. So you can find a lot of information on Kotlin, functional programming, how we introduced it, and kind of how you can introduce it as well, just by searching for our names on YouTube.
And I would say a great way to contact us is through Twitter, and you can take a look at our public GitHubs as well. And we do have a new Instagram called Coder Queens, where we're posting a lot of content, and we'd love for you to connect with us there as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This was awesome. We actually talked a little bit about the interview process too, which I hadn't planned for. So
awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got to actually come on the podcast a year in the works. So we're excited to be here, and we appreciate you guys reaching out.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining. And just a side note to our audience, we have a couple more episodes coming out later this year. Raja, I have to work out scheduling on that, so stay tuned for that. And then we have a special guest coming on. Not going to reveal exactly all the details there. It's kind of a surprise for the Lambda show.
Is it Beyonce? It's Beyonce, isn't it? Right. It's got to be Beyonce.
It's totally Beyonce. No, I will just briefly say we are going to discuss with her some topics on data science. It won't be functional programming, but we will get back to that again as well. So stay tuned for those episodes coming up this year. And then we're going to take a short little break over the holidays and probably resume early next year. That's about all, folks. Thanks again for joining. And you can see more episodes on lambda.show is our website. You can also tune in on Apple iTunes. We have Pocket Cast. We are not on Spotify currently because they do not support video. And we have video in some of our episodes. Spotify, please fix that. I'm going to call this out every episode until you do. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day, Katie and Shelby.
Thanks so much for being on the show. We'll see you.
Thank you. You too.